Captain Sarah Hayes died 7 years ago in a secret military mission. Her family buried an empty coffin. Her squadron holds memorial services every year. But when Flight 847's pilot collapsed at 35,000 feet, a mysterious woman appeared in the cockpit. She knew every button, every procedure. The dead don't fly planes. It was March 15, 2025, and Captain Sarah Hayes had been officially dead for exactly 7 years. The military records at Edwards Air Force Base in California still listed her status as killed in action, body not recovered. Every year on this date, her former squadron held a memorial ceremony. They would stand in formation, salute an empty chair, and remember the woman who had vanished during Operation Nightfall, a classified mission so secret that even her family never learned the details. Sarah's parents had buried an empty coffin in Arlington National Cemetery. Her younger brother, David, now a commercial airline pilot himself, still wore her dog tags around his neck. The aviation community spoke of her in hushed tones, the elite test pilot who had pushed the boundaries of what was possible, only to disappear behind enemy lines in a mission that officially never happened. But Sarah Hayes wasn't dead. She was very much alive, and at this exact moment she was sitting in seat 23A aboard United Airlines Flight 847, flying from Los Angeles to New York at 35,000 feet. 7 years earlier, Sarah had been chosen for Operation Nightfall because she was the best, top 1% of military pilots, expert in stealth aircraft, and fluent in 3 languages. The mission was simple in concept but deadly in execution: infiltrate North Korean airspace, gather intelligence on their new missile program, and return without being detected. Everything went wrong from the start. Her advanced stealth fighter suffered multiple system failures over the target zone. When North Korean surface-to-air missiles locked onto her position, Sarah had 2 choices: eject and face capture, or attempt an impossible landing in enemy territory. She chose a third option, one that didn't exist in any manual. Using skills that even her instructors didn't know she possessed, Sarah crash-landed her damaged aircraft in a remote mountain valley. But instead of attempting escape or waiting for rescue, she made a decision that would change everything. She abandoned her aircraft, destroyed all identifying equipment, and disappeared into the North Korean wilderness. For 7 years, Sarah lived off the grid. She became a ghost, moving through underground networks, gathering intelligence, and slowly working her way across hostile territories. The woman who emerged from this crucible was no longer just an elite pilot. She was something more dangerous, more capable than anyone could imagine. Captain Robert Chin had been flying commercial aircraft for 15 years, but he'd never experienced anything like this. At 2:47 p.m. Eastern Time, somewhere over Pennsylvania, the 52-year-old pilot suddenly collapsed in his seat. His hands went limp on the controls, his breathing became shallow, and his eyes rolled back. First Officer Maria Santos shook her colleague desperately, but there was no response. The Boeing 777 began to drift slightly off course as the autopilot struggled to compensate for the sudden loss of input. In the passenger cabin, 340 people continued their conversations, read their books, and dozed peacefully, unaware that their lives now hung in the balance. The flight attendants maintained their professional composure, but Maria could see the fear in their eyes when she announced over the intercom that they were experiencing a minor medical emergency and asked everyone to remain calm and stay seated. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a cardiologist returning from a medical conference, was the first passenger to respond to the call for medical assistance. After examining Captain Chin in the cockpit, her face went pale. He'd had a massive stroke, she whispered to Maria. His vital signs were critical and he needed immediate emergency care. But they were still 2 hours from New York, flying over remote terrain with no nearby airports suitable for an emergency landing. Maria had logged over 3,000 flight hours, but she had never flown as pilot in command of a widebody aircraft. Her hands trembled slightly as she keyed the radio to contact air traffic control, declaring a pilot incapacitation emergency and requesting immediate assistance and priority handling to the nearest suitable airport. New York Center responded quickly, asking about the current pilot situation. Maria explained that one pilot was down with a medical emergency, that she was First Officer Santos, and that she would need full emergency assistance for approach and landing procedures. As Maria spoke into her headset, she didn't notice the passenger cabin door opening behind her. She didn't see the woman who moved with silent, fluid steps past the flight attendants, who somehow didn't question her presence in the restricted area. She didn't realize someone had entered the cockpit until she heard a calm, confident voice say that she was there to help. Maria spun around and nearly fell out of her seat. Standing behind her was a woman in her mid-30s with short dark hair, wearing simple civilian clothes, jeans, a black sweater, and boots that looked designed for serious travel. But it wasn't her appearance that shocked Maria, it was her presence, the way she carried herself with absolute confidence, the way her eyes immediately assessed every instrument and display in the cockpit, the way she moved like she belonged there. Maria demanded to know who she was and how she had gotten in, since the area was restricted. The woman stepped forward and placed a gentle but firm hand on Maria's shoulder, introducing herself as Sarah Hayes, a military-trained pilot, and acknowledging that this was confusing but that right now what mattered was getting all 340 people safely on the ground. The name meant nothing to Maria, but something about this stranger's demeanor was both calming and deeply unsettling. Maria insisted she needed identification before she could allow anything. Sarah replied that there was no time, that the captain was dying, that they were running low on fuel, and that severe weather was moving in from the west, gesturing at the radar. Despite herself, Maria glanced at the weather display and saw that Sarah was right. A massive storm system was approaching their flight path, something that would complicate any emergency landing attempt. How could this passenger have known to check that? Sarah moved to the empty jump seat behind the captain's position and began scanning the flight instruments with the practiced eye of someone who had spent thousands of hours in similar cockpits. She correctly identified the aircraft as a Boeing 777-300, noted their flight level and airspeed, calculated the distance to JFK, and asked about their fuel state. The precision of her question sent a chill down Maria's spine. This wasn't casual passenger curiosity, it was professional pilot assessment. But who was this woman, and how had she gotten past security, past the flight attendants, past every barrier that should have kept unauthorized personnel out of the cockpit? Maria stammered that she couldn't just let a passenger take control of the aircraft, that there were procedures and regulations. Sarah replied that those regulations assumed the captain was conscious and capable, that they assumed there was someone qualified to help. And that right now she was the most qualified person on the aircraft, and every second spent talking was a second they couldn't afford to lose. While Maria struggled with the impossible decision, Sarah had already begun helping in ways that shouldn't have been possible for an ordinary passenger. She contacted air traffic control on a secondary radio frequency, coordinating with approach control to clear a path for their emergency descent. She calculated fuel consumption rates and optimal glide paths with a mental speed that impressed even Maria. When New York Approach asked for confirmation of the emergency pilot's qualifications, Maria, looking to Sarah, who nodded calmly, told them that their emergency pilot was highly qualified, with a military background and extensive experience in aircraft similar to this type. But even as she spoke those words, Maria felt a growing dread. Everything about this situation was wrong. Passengers didn't just appear in cockpits during emergencies. People with military flight training didn't travel anonymously on commercial aircraft without any identification. And most disturbing of all, Sarah Hayes handled every aspect of the emergency with a calm competence that suggested she had faced far worse situations than this. As they began their emergency descent toward JFK, Maria quietly told Sarah that she needed to know who she really was, what her military background was, what unit she had been with. For the first time since entering the cockpit, Sarah hesitated. Her hands paused over the controls, and Maria saw something flicker across her face, not fear, but sadness. Finally, Sarah said she had been with the 412th Test Wing at Edwards Air Force Base, call sign Ghost Rider. Maria's blood ran cold. Every pilot in the industry knew about the 412th Test Wing. They were legends in the aviation community, and she had heard stories about a female pilot from that unit who had died in a classified mission years earlier, a pilot whose name had become synonymous with courage and sacrifice. Maria whispered that it was impossible, that Sarah Hayes from the 412th had died 7 years ago, that there had been a memorial service, that she was buried at Arlington. Sarah's smile was sad and knowing. She asked Maria if she had ever seen a ghost fly a plane. As Flight 847 descended through 10,000 feet toward JFK, Sarah took primary control of the aircraft with Maria serving as co-pilot. Despite the impossibility of the situation, despite every rational thought telling her this couldn't be real, Maria found herself trusting the mysterious woman who had appeared from nowhere. Sarah's piloting skills were beyond anything Maria had ever witnessed. She compensated for wind shear with micro-adjustments that seemed to anticipate atmospheric conditions before they appeared on the instruments. She managed the aircraft's energy state with a precision that made the emergency approach look routine. Most remarkably, she did all of this while simultaneously coordinating with air traffic control, monitoring Captain Chin's medical condition, and keeping the passenger cabin calm through periodic announcements, addressing them as their interim captain, explaining that they were making an unscheduled landing in New York due to a medical emergency with the original captain, that the aircraft was performing normally, that weather conditions were acceptable, and that they expected to be on the ground within 15 minutes. In the passenger cabin, people noticed that the voice was different, not First Officer Santos but someone else entirely, and some passengers began to whisper nervously among themselves about who was flying their plane. Dr. Walsh had stabilized Captain Chin as much as possible, but his condition remained critical. She told Sarah during one of her visits to the cockpit that he needed immediate surgery and asked how much longer until they landed. Sarah replied, 8 minutes, without taking her eyes off the instruments, adding that she had contacted the tower and that they had emergency medical personnel standing by on the runway. As they aligned with runway 31L at JFK, Maria watched in amazement as Sarah executed what could only be described as a perfect emergency landing. Despite the stress, the unknown variables, and the weight of 340 lives depending on her skill, she brought the massive aircraft down with a gentleness that barely registered on the passengers' awareness. The moment Flight 847 came to a stop at JFK, emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Paramedics rushed aboard to treat Captain Chin, while federal aviation officials and security personnel began the complex process of investigating what had happened during the flight. Sarah stood calmly in the cockpit as officials flooded the area, her hands clasped behind her back in a military posture that Maria now recognized. FBI agents, FAA investigators, and airport security all demanded identification, explanations, and answers to questions that seemed to have no logical response. Agent Rebecca Morrison from the FBI said firmly that they needed to see her identification and pilot's license, and that they needed to understand how she had gained access to the cockpit and what authority she'd had to take control of the aircraft. Sarah reached into her jacket and produced a small leather wallet. Inside was a military ID card that made Agent Morrison's eyes widen in shock. The card bore Sarah's photograph, her rank as captain in the United States Air Force, and an expiration date that was current. But it also bore something impossible, a designation showing she was listed as active duty. Agent Morrison muttered that this couldn't be right, that according to their records Captain Sarah Hayes had been declared killed in action 7 years ago, that her status was listed as deceased in every military database. Sarah told her to check again. Agent Morrison made several phone calls to various government agencies, each conversation becoming more heated and confused than the last. Finally she hung up and stared at Sarah with a mixture of fear and fascination, telling her that she had just spoken with officials at the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, and the CIA, and that they all confirmed she had been declared dead 7 years earlier following a classified mission, but that they also confirmed her security clearances had never been revoked, her military ID remained active, and there were gaps in the official record they could not or would not explain. As the investigation continued through the night at a secure facility near JFK Airport, Sarah finally began to reveal the truth about the 7 years that officially never happened. She explained to a room full of federal officials, military officers, and aviation authorities that Operation Nightfall hadn't just been an intelligence-gathering mission but the beginning of something much larger. When her aircraft went down in North Korea, she'd had 2 choices: attempt escape and risk exposing American capabilities, or disappear completely and continue the mission from deep cover. General Patricia Hawkins, who had flown in from the Pentagon specifically for this debriefing, leaned forward and asked how she could have continued the mission when she was presumed dead, when they had held a memorial service. Sarah replied that the memorial service had been necessary, that her official death had provided perfect cover for what came next. For 7 years she had been operating in some of the most dangerous regions in the world: North Korea, Iran, Syria, Afghanistan, places where Sarah Hayes the test pilot could never go. But Sarah Hayes the ghost could go anywhere. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Sarah hadn't been missing for 7 years. She had been working, operating as a deep cover agent in situations too dangerous for official personnel, gathering intelligence that had prevented terrorist attacks, wars, and international incidents. General Hawkins asked slowly whether the intelligence she had provided, the reports about missile programs, terrorist cells, and weapon shipments, had come from her. Sarah confirmed that some of it had, explaining that the work had required complete anonymity, no contact with family, no acknowledgement of her survival, no official support. She had become someone who didn't exist, which had made her very effective at her job. Agent Morrison asked the obvious question: why reveal herself now? Why risk everything to save a commercial flight? Sarah's answer was simple and direct. 340 innocent people had needed help, and she had been the only person on that aircraft qualified to provide it. Some things were more important than maintaining cover. As news of Flight 847's emergency landing spread through media outlets, the story became increasingly complicated. Initial reports focused on the mysterious passenger who had helped land the aircraft, but as more details emerged, the narrative became almost impossible to believe. Captain Sarah Hayes, officially dead for 7 years, memorial services held, grave marker in Arlington National Cemetery, had saved 340 lives by appearing in a cockpit and demonstrating piloting skills that exceeded even her original legendary abilities. Her family was contacted by military officials and asked to come to New York for a reunion none of them had ever expected to experience. Her parents, now in their 70s, broke down crying when they received the phone call. Her brother David, who had followed her into aviation partly to honor her memory, had to pull his own aircraft over at a small airport in Texas because he couldn't stop shaking long enough to continue flying. The passengers from Flight 847 were interviewed extensively by investigators, and their accounts painted a picture of a woman who had appeared from nowhere with knowledge and skills that seemed almost supernatural. Maria Santos, the first officer who had worked most closely with Sarah during the emergency, told reporters that Sarah had known that aircraft better than pilots who had been flying 777s for decades, that she had anticipated problems before they appeared on the instruments, that it was like she could see things the rest of them couldn't. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the cardiologist who had treated Captain Chin during the flight, added that in 20 years of emergency medicine she had never seen anyone remain so calm under such intense pressure, that Sarah hadn't just been flying the airplane but managing every aspect of a complex emergency while making it look effortless. The reunion between Sarah and her family took place in a secure conference room at the Federal Building near JFK Airport. Military officials, FBI agents, and other government personnel watched from behind one-way glass as 7 years of grief and loss were confronted by the impossible reality of Sarah's survival. Her mother, Ellen Hayes, was the first to speak, saying through tears that they had buried her, that they had held a funeral, that she visited her grave every week and brought flowers. Sarah replied that she knew, that she had wanted to contact them so many times, that there were nights she had almost broken cover just to call and let them know she was alive, but the mission had been too important and the risks too great. Her father, retired Colonel James Hayes, understood the military implications better than the rest of the family, asking slowly what kind of intelligence work required 7 years of deep cover operations and that level of sacrifice. Sarah answered that it was the kind that prevented wars, that stopped terrorist attacks before they happened, the kind that saved thousands of lives by sacrificing the happiness of one person in her family. Her brother David, still wearing her dog tags, struggled with emotions that ranged from joy to anger, asking if she understood what her death had done to them, that their parents had aged 10 years overnight, that he had changed his entire career path to honor her memory, that they had grieved and mourned her every single day. Sarah said simply that she knew, and that she was sorry, but asked whether he would rather she had contacted them and risked exposing operations that saved innocent lives, whether he would rather have had occasional phone calls if it meant terrorist attacks had succeeded because her cover was blown. The questions hung in the air without answers, because they were the kinds of questions that had no right answers, only necessary choices. While Sarah's family struggled with the emotional complexity of her return, federal investigators were dealing with their own set of impossible questions. How does a person who has been dead for 7 years maintain active security clearances? How does someone with no official existence for 7 years possess updated knowledge of commercial aircraft systems? Most importantly, How do the official records show Sarah Hayes dying in 2018 while simultaneously showing she never stopped being an active-duty military officer? Agent Morrison led a team of investigators who spent 3 days going through classified files, military records, and intelligence reports that painted a picture of a ghost who had been more active than most living operatives. She explained to her supervisor that the paper trail was incredible. Captain Hayes had officially died on March 15, 2018, but starting the very next day, intelligence reports had begun coming in from deep cover sources in North Korea with information that could only have come from someone with her specific training and access. The reports had been coded and filtered through so many channels that no one had connected them to her, but the pattern was clear in retrospect. The deeper they investigated, the more impressive Sarah's 7-year operation became. She had prevented a nuclear weapons sale between North Korea and Iran. She had provided intelligence that stopped a major terrorist attack in Europe. She had infiltrated weapons trafficking networks and provided information that saved dozens of undercover operatives in various countries. Agent Morrison concluded that Sarah hadn't just been surviving for 7 years, she had been running, single-handedly, one of the most successful deep cover operations in modern intelligence history. News of Sarah's survival and her role in saving Flight 847 spread quickly through the aviation community, where her original reputation had achieved almost mythical status over the 7 years since her supposed death. The Society of Experimental Test Pilots, which had named an annual award in her honor, found themselves in the unusual position of deciding whether to continue memorializing someone who was no longer dead. The Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards had a building named after her. The 99s, the International Organization of Women Pilots, had established a scholarship fund in her memory. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, a commercial airline pilot who had been inspired to pursue aviation partly because of Sarah's example, told reporters that Sarah Hayes had already been a legend in their community, and that now she was something more than that, proof that the impossible could happen, that people could vanish from the world and still find ways to make it a better place. The technical aspects of Sarah's performance during the Flight 847 emergency became the subject of intense analysis within aviation circles. Experienced pilots who reviewed the flight data recordings were amazed by the precision of her flying, the smoothness of her emergency procedures, and, most remarkably, the way she seemed to anticipate aircraft behavior before it was reflected on the instruments. Colonel Martinez, her former commanding officer at Edwards, said her stick and rudder skills had always been exceptional, but what she had demonstrated on Flight 847 was beyond anything he had ever seen. 7 years of whatever she had been doing had made her a better pilot than she already was, and she had already been the best. As the initial excitement of Sarah's miraculous return began to fade, the full cost of her 7-year absence became clear. The woman who had saved Flight 847 was not the same person who had disappeared over North Korea in 2018. During extensive debriefings with military psychologists, Sarah revealed details about her years of deep cover that painted a picture of unimaginable isolation and constant danger. She had lived under dozens of different identities, spoken languages her family didn't know she had learned, and survived in conditions that would have broken most people. She told Drive, Amanda Foster, a military psychiatrist, that there had been months at a time when she didn't speak English, periods when she wasn't sure if Sarah Hayes was even a real person anymore or just another cover identity she had used so long ago she could barely remember it. The psychological toll was evident in ways that her family and colleagues were only beginning to understand. Sarah startled at unexpected noises. She unconsciously positioned herself with clear views of exits in every room. She slept lightly and often woke up reaching for weapons that weren't there. Most disturbingly, she admitted that she sometimes had trouble distinguishing between her various cover identities and her original personality. She explained that when you live as someone else for years at a time, you start to become that person, that she had been an arms dealer, a refugee, a journalist, a smuggler, and a dozen other people, and that sometimes she wasn't sure which parts of her personality were originally hers and which parts she had picked up from identities she'd had to maintain. 3 weeks after the Flight 847 incident, Sarah faced a decision that would determine the rest of her life. Military officials offered her several options: return to active duty with full acknowledgement of her service, take a medical retirement with full benefits and recognition, or disappear again to continue deep cover operations in other parts of the world. Her family desperately wanted her to choose retirement, to finally come home and try to rebuild the relationships that had been severed by 7 years of enforced absence. Her mother had already prepared her old room. Her father had cleared space in his workshop for projects they could work on together. Her brother had bought a small aircraft that he hoped they could restore as a family project. But Sarah had seen too much of the world's darkness to simply walk away from the work that had defined her for 7 years. She explained to her family during one of their meetings that there were operations running right now that depended on the intelligence she had gathered, that there were people in dangerous situations who had trusted her with their lives, and that she couldn't just abandon them. The aviation community, meanwhile, wanted her to return to test flying, to push the boundaries of what was possible the same way she had before her disappearance. Aircraft manufacturers had new experimental designs that would benefit from her unique combination of technical skills and practical experience. The Air Force had classified projects that could advance aviation technology by decades. General Hawkins told her during one of their meetings that she had already given 7 years of her life to her country, that she had served with honor and distinction in ways most people would never know about, and that she had earned the right to choose what came next. On a clear morning in April 2025, exactly 1 month after she had appeared in the cockpit of Flight 847, Sarah Hayes made her decision. She would return to active duty, but with modifications that reflected her unique experience and capabilities. The Air Force created a new position specifically for her, Special Operations Aviation Advisor. Her role would involve training other pilots for deep cover missions, developing new techniques for operating in hostile environments, and serving as a bridge between the aviation community and intelligence operations. Most importantly, her new position would be officially acknowledged. No more ghosts, no more pretending to be dead, no more years of isolation from family and friends. She would serve her country in ways that allowed her to maintain the relationships that had sustained her through 7 years of darkness. Her first assignment was to establish a training program for pilots who might need to operate in situations similar to what she had experienced. The program would teach not just flying skills but survival techniques, language capabilities, and the psychological resilience needed to maintain deep cover for extended periods. She explained to a gathering of military officials and aviation experts that they were creating something new, a way to prepare pilots for missions that went beyond anything traditionally considered part of aviation training, because the world had changed and pilots needed to be ready for challenges previous generations had never faced. Exactly 1 year after the emergency landing that had revealed Sarah's survival, United Airlines held a special ceremony at JFK Airport to honor everyone involved in saving Flight 847. Captain Robert Chin, who had made a full recovery from his stroke, was there to meet the woman who had saved his life and the lives of his passengers. He told Sarah that he didn't remember anything about the flight after he collapsed, but that he had read the flight data recordings and talked to Maria and the passengers, and that what she had done that day was nothing short of miraculous. First Officer Maria Santos, who had been promoted to captain partly because of her performance during the emergency, introduced Sarah to her family, telling her young daughter that this was the woman she had told her about, the one who taught her that heroes can appear when you least expect them. Many of the passengers from Flight 847 attended the ceremony, eager to meet the mysterious woman who had appeared from nowhere to save them. Their stories painted a picture of someone who had not just demonstrated exceptional piloting skills but who had managed to keep nearly 350 people calm during one of the most terrifying experiences of their lives. Jennifer Kim, a teacher from Los Angeles, said she had known something was wrong when they called for a doctor, but then a calm voice had come over the intercom and somehow she had just known everything was going to be okay, that there had been something about that voice that made you believe that no matter how bad things were, she could handle it. 5 years have passed since Sarah Hayes returned from the dead to save Flight 847. She now leads one of the most elite aviation training programs in the world, preparing pilots for missions that exist in the gray areas between military operations and civilian aviation. Her family has slowly healed from the 7 years of grief and loss, though the scars of her absence will never completely fade. Her parents have learned to treasure every phone call, every visit, every ordinary moment they once took for granted. Her brother David flies as her co-pilot whenever their schedules allow, making up for the years when they couldn't share their love of aviation. Sarah herself has found a balance between the ghost she had to become and the person she wanted to remain. She still wakes up sometimes reaching for weapons that aren't there. she still positions herself with clear views of exits. But she also laughs with her family, teaches young pilots to push beyond their perceived limitations, and has learned to live in the present instead of constantly preparing for unknown dangers. The passengers of Flight 847 have gone back to their normal lives, but many of them still think about that day when their ordinary flight became extraordinary because of a woman who wasn't supposed to exist. They tell their friends and families about the ghost who appeared in their hour of greatest need and how she proved that heroes can come from the most impossible places. In the aviation community, Sarah Hayes has become something even more legendary than she was before her disappearance. She's no longer just the test pilot who pushed boundaries, she's the pilot who came back from the dead to save lives, who spent 7 years in the shadows protecting people who never knew they needed protecting. Her story has been classified in many of its details, but the parts that can be told have become the stuff of aviation legend. Young pilots learn about her technical skills, her survival capabilities, and, most importantly, her reminder that being a pilot means being ready to serve others, even when the cost is everything you hold dear. Flight 847 landed safely on March 15, 2025, because a ghost decided to become human again. And in doing so, Sarah Hayes proved that some disappearances are not endings but preparations for the moment when the impossible becomes necessary and heroes reveal themselves in the most unexpected ways. On quiet nights at Edwards Air Force Base, when new test pilots are learning to push the boundaries of what aircraft can do, instructors still tell the story of Captain Sarah Hayes. They talk about the mission that made her disappear, the years that made her stronger, and the moment when she chose to save 340 strangers instead of protecting the secret that had kept her alive. It's a story about sacrifice and survival, about the cost of serving something larger than yourself, and about the truth that heroes are not born in moments of glory but forged in years of quiet service that no one sees. And sometimes, when conditions are just right and the need is great enough, those heroes step out of the shadows to remind us that the impossible is just another word for something that hasn't happened yet. Captain Sarah Hayes, call sign Ghost Rider, flew her last mission as a ghost on March 15, 2025. But her first mission as a hero who chooses to be seen began the moment she walked into that cockpit and decided that 340 lives were more important than 7 years of careful invisibility. The ghost came home, and in coming home, she saved everyone.